It's not that bad. Okay, but I want to finish out this stuff.
Sorry,
Okay, great. Trying to get started.
Good morning. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for being here. It's so exciting to actually welcome you all to this wonderful event in person. Thank you for turning out, but we also have a full complement. Full complement as well online, part of the broader Small Axe family, as well as the greater Care Visitors Network family. Okay. I won't be very long. I just want to kind of do a brief welcome and thanks. Of course, special thanks to Charles Val Carnegie, whose book we're celebrating 20 years of Post-Nationalism Prefigured. So please give a warm welcome and thanks to Professor Carnegie. Of course, I want to thank Ron Cummings for spearheading this event. And he'll talk to you in a little bit. Also to my co-organizer, Matthew Chin from WGS here at UVA, as well as David Scott from the broader Small Axe family for taking up this call. I do want to give a couple of thanks to our sponsors. So the Center for Global Inquiry and Innovation, the Departments of English, Africana Studies, and Anthropology, as well as Women and Gender Studies. So thank you all for making this event possible. I'm having some feedback, and this is a little distressing. Let's take a small break.
Yeah, so,
Yours is muted, right?
yeah, mine is muted. Yep. And my sound is on.
This room does have good audio, but we want to make sure that we're audible on Zoom as well. Sounds good, right? No feedback?
Yes.
Thank you so much. All right, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ron Cummings. I won't embarrass him, but and I say colleague, it feels very formal because we're just old. We go way back. We come from the same small town in Jamaica, and our paths have crossed in many, many ways since then. And so I'm still very, very happy to welcome him in person to UK in Charlottesville. So Professor Ron Cummings.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's great to see you all, and it's great to have these kinds of gatherings. I have missed these over the last couple of years. So this morning feels really special. A big thank you to Matthew Chin, who's done sort of wonderful work in sort of convening us all and bringing us together, and to Njelle as well for helping to make this event possible. So I was asked to do framing remarks. I don't know how much these will be framing remarks, but there are some reflections to get us going in our discussion today. I've written down a few things, so I try to keep to time. To celebrate the 20th anniversary of Post-Nationalism Prefigured, Caribbean Borderlands, is to also realize that it is now almost 20 years since I entered graduate school. I met Val Carnegie in my third year of grad school. And last night we were trying to figure out, whether we had met in 2004 or 2005. But that would have been about 3 years or so after the book was published. I had somehow discovered the book and had read it by the time I met Val. And at the time I was asking similar questions about national discontents, but in relationship to queerness and marronage. And some of that early thinking is reflected in an article I wrote titled Transnationalism, Marronage, and Queer Caribbean Subjectivities. And perhaps because that work came out of a kind of thinking with Val's work and other anthropologists, it found a home in the journal Transforming Anthropology. It's the only thing I've ever published in an anthropology journal. But what I remember is that Val's book proved immensely useful in reshaping and expanding some of the questions that I was asking. It is, after all, a book that is expansive in its way. Perhaps I would venture to call it horizontal in its vision. And this is a point I'll come back to. Not only had I encountered this work, but I was now meeting the author. And I won't forget a long afternoon of delightful conversation that we shared up at Mona, and Val's wonderful generosity in listening to the thoughts and questions of a young graduate student just formulating his questions. And I mentioned this to also underscore the mentoring work that Val has done in his own quiet way. Younger scholars like myself have undoubtedly benefited from his urgings to think more deeply and from his willingness to dialogue. So for me, the book Post-Nationalism Prefigured is itself a testament to Val's collegial and collaborative way of thinking. And perhaps one might say that this is Caribbean anthropology as a practice at its best, an engagement in dialogue and a listening for something. Although the opening chapter, Dundas and the Nation, begins with the personal, the book moves through and embraces a really impressive and expansive archive. In many instances, such as the reflections on the Maroons in the chapter Caliban's early pioneering journeys, or the chapter on the Garvey movement titled A Politics of Trans-Territorial Solidarity, it reconsiders the past and the archive of Caribbean studies in a process of pushing frontiers and remapping the terms of dialogue outward, moving us always beyond nationalist thinking to other possibilities and horizons for rethinking self, community, and relation. So we might read Post-Nationalism Prefigured as one culminating text in a theoretical decade that started with Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic and Carol Boyce Davies's Black Woman Writing and Identity Migrations of the Subject. And those were published in 1993 and 1994 respectively. And they offered a sort of critical centering of questions of diaspora, migrations, mobility, and transnationalism. Carnegie in this book offers some brilliant summative moments that synthesize and reflect on some of the debates in the wake of these texts, and is a useful primer in this regard. But Val also thinks across different scales in addressing these questions by situating and theorizing, for instance, the transfrontier movements of higglers alongside the complexity of transnational lives, and in doing this, he also turns to fiction, and I'm really sort of struck by the fact that he's thinking with Lorna Goodison's short story, Bellamy's Life, to tease out the desires and the dreams that shape moments of movement. And in this regard, this work can be read as a meaningful dialogue with our panel, Rachel Goffe's work, and her concerns with placemaking and livelihood, as central to theorizations of Black life, and her thinking about these questions through insecure land use and squatting, and the way they both, Val and Rachel, ask us to rethink state narratives through attending to the complexities of people's everyday lives that exceed but are also at the same time regulated by the state. And we look forward to Rachel's presentation today as part of the wider conversation and reflection. Val's willingness to draw on a variety of texts, or what I've called an expansive archive, is a hallmark of this work. As a literary scholar, I came to this text as an already welcoming terrain because I found here discussions of Lorna Goodison's work, C.L.R. James's writing, Derek Walcott's essays, Dennis Scott's poetry, to name a few of the literary figures whose theorizing we meet here. Carnegie reminds us in a sustained way that Caribbean studies is an interdisciplinary thinking practice throughout this work, and that its texts are varied. And we're excited to have Val's longtime friend and colleague, Timothy Chin, a foremost Caribbean literary scholar, who readily said yes to joining this conversation. And I do also want to say that one of the joys about reading Val's work, but also Timothy Chin's work, is that they cite each other. There's a sort of practice of intellectual friendship that offers us these glimpses and traces of conversations, but also conference papers that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. And for me, this is part of that work of collaborative thinking that I see Val engaging in. But while the book is about some of these questions of space, territoriality, and movement, as well as method and practice, what is striking to me and remains so as I revisit the text today is also how prescient and astute it is in thinking about time and questions of temporality. For example, Val's thinking on modernity at the start of part 3 of the book as not just an organizing framework, but as a categorical question and problem is instructive to think with alongside Gilroy's work, which preceded it. And some of his theoretical questioning is usefully expanded in rich and generative ways in Deb Thomas's work in her critical tour de force Modern Blackness, published 2 years after Val's book. And we don't know if Deb will revisit some of these questions today, but that also shaped her thinking as organizers in inviting Deb into this conversation. In also thinking about Val's reflections on temporality, we can position his work in relationship to some of David Scott's work on temporality in Refashioning Futures, which appeared in 1999, 3 years before Val's book. And Val and David are part of a chorus that asks us to expand and rethink the sovereign dreams of the independence generation. And we look forward to the dialogue between them today, already aware that this is an ongoing and long dialogue that has been taking place. I want to also note that all the panelists quite enthusiastically and readily said yes to coming into this dialogue. And this speaks not just to the value of Val's work, but I would also say is a testament to his generosity as a scholar and a colleague. So one of the questions that we're engaging with today and which we thought about as we were planning this event is a question of what is the ongoing value of post-nationalism prefigured for us today in this time. And I want to close briefly with some thoughts on this as part of the contribution to the dialogue. So in thinking about Val's attention to temporality, I want to tentatively posit that he offers us what we might think about as a kind of Caribbean futurism. This is different from, though not distinct and certainly not separate from, Afrofuturism as a framework. So here is Val in the preface to his book. He says, quote, "I search for an anticipatory anthropology that examines both past and present, in search not only of fatalities and futilities, but also of potential," end of quote. So his attention to modes of prefiguring that we might apprehend in the story of the Maroons or in the Goffe movement is part of an attention to Caribbean futurism. And he certainly anticipates the attention to temporalities that marks much of Caribbean critical studies today. And I'm thinking here about Njelle's brilliant work in Phonographic Memories, which also asks us to think about the uses of nostalgia. But what I'm suggesting here is that we can read Val's, contentions and attentions in this book in relation to someone like Jose Muniz's work, for example, in Cruising Utopia, and his horizontal thinking. And you might also recognize here that I'm trying to claim Moniz as part of the Caribbean critical framework, where for me, Cuba is not just part of the prefiguring of his work, but is also present in the kinds of questions that he's asking and the kinds of utopian impulses that shapes that work. And in bringing these works together, I want to finally argue that Val's work is marked by a kind of utopian impulse itself, in the very best sense of the term. So consider his closing sentence of the book. To achieve a global vision and global citizenship, we must be endowed, quote, with a new eye, a new air, a new heart, and a new mind. And of course, this is written, if we think about like when this book comes out, it's written in the post-9/11 moment, whereas Jasper Poore notes in her discussions of home nationalism, there's a kind of folding of the marginalized subject international imaginings. And the challenge for me of Val's work is that it constantly asks us to continue to imagine and engage more expansive terms of citizenship as an ethical question. So I think those are some of the questions that we might engage with as we come back to this book today. I really look forward to the conversations that will follow and thank Val for this wonderful work. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Matthew Chin, who has just been stellar in organizing this event and bringing us all together. And Matthew will introduce our panelists and speakers today.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm just gonna briefly give I guess, the bio of all of the people we've invited here today. Charles or Val Carnegie is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anthropology and Program in Africana Studies at Bates College. He's the author of Postnationalism Prefigured, Caribbean Borderlands, and co-editor of Afro-Caribbean Villages in Historical Perspective. He's also published several articles and chapters in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes in the fields of anthropology and Caribbean studies. Carnegie is currently engaged in 2 research projects. The first, Making and Unmaking of Jamaican Civil Society, the Problem of the Social, looks at the beginning of social science research and NGO community development efforts in the Caribbean in the mid-20th century. The second, Kingston-based Kingston Time, investigates the cultural politics of contemporary Kingston, Jamaica, and the prospects for community renewal. Timothy Chin is a professor of English at California State University, Dominguez Hills. His research considers diasporic and transnational approaches to questions of gender and sexuality in African American and Caribbean literature. His articles on Caribbean literature and Chinese Jamaican transmigrancy have appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Kalaloo, Small Axe, Amerasia Journal, Social and Economic Studies, and New West Indian Guide. Ronald Cummings is an associate professor of Caribbean literature and Black diaspora studies at McMaster University. He's the editor of Make the World New, the poetry of Lillian Allen, and co-editor of 3 volumes, including Harriet's Legacies, Race, Historical Memory, and Futures in Canada, Caribbean Literature in Transition, 1970 to 2020, and the fight at that time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George William Occupation. His work has appeared in numerous journals, including Small Axe, Transforming Anthropology, Topia, and the Journal of West Indian Literature. Rachel Goffe is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto Scarborough. As a geographer and licensed architect, her work investigates the relationship between livelihood, placemaking, and public policy. Goffe's research focuses on Jamaica, where she considers the encounter between policies to curtail squatting and the traditions of Black life that emerged through the durable yet insecure possession of small parcels of land. Her research has appeared in the journal Anthropology and the edited volumes The Fight to Stay Put and Revolting New York. David Scott is the Ruth and William Lubic Professor and Chair of the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. He's the author of several monographs, including Formations of Ritual, Colonial and Anthropological Discourses on the Sinhala Yactoville, Refashioning Futures, Criticism After Postcoloniality, Conscripts of Modernity, The Tragedy of Colonial Enlightenment, and Omens of Adversity, Tragedy, Time, Memory, Justice. He's currently completing a book tentatively titled Irreparable Evil, New World Slavery and World History, and working on a biography of Stuart Hall that builds on his earlier monographs, Stuart Hall's Voice, Intimations of an Ethic of Receptive Generosity. He's a founder and editor of the journal Small Acts and the director of the Small Acts Project. In this context, he has served as a curatorial director of the exhibitions Caribbean Queer Visualities, The Visual Life of Social Affliction, and most recently, the Kingston Biennial Pressure this year. Deborah Thomas is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center of Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Political Life in the Wake of Plantation, Entanglement, Witnessing Repair, Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. Thomas also directed and co-produced 2 films, Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, and 4 Days in May, and co-curated the multimedia installation Bearing Witness 4 Days in West Kingston. She sits on the editorial committee of the Journal of Social and Economic Studies and served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of American Anthropologists between 2016 and 2020. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful guests here today. The structure for the event is we're going to be 3 of our panelists are going to be presenting papers, and then we'll be having an interview between David Scott and Charles Carnegie. So we'll turn it over to Rachel Prof. Thank you so much. Yes.
I want to thank Dr. Carnegie for Post-Nationalism Prefigured, Ronald Cummings and Matthew Chin for the invitation. I'm honored and not a little intimidated to speak alongside Deborah Thomas, Timothy Chin, and to witness in person a mini David Scott interview. Dr. Scott's interviews have deeply informed inquiries about the life and life work of people we need to know better, an archival practice I value as a junior scholar. I look forward to knowing Dr. Carnegie better through this collective engagement. I really like this book. I say that in part as a geographer, in light of inquiries from Caribbean anthropologists regarding the behemoth that is the annual meeting of the American Association of Geographers. Those questions, perhaps triggered by the sexiness of spatial metaphor, are imbued with disciplinary anxiety. Surprising because, as this book so beautifully demonstrates, Caribbean life is itself saturated with a finely tuned sense of the production of space, its materiality and incomplete truths, the lived experience of the power of state and capital to materialize a story about the correct ordering of space that is harmful to many dwelling in and moving through space, borders, territories, property, and even development. Even as space is amended to some end, infrastructure, conveyance, sanctuary, planning, or abandoned to its own ends. Infrastructures that trap, roots that once were and are no more, and the subversion of this power. And beyond that, the enactment of alternate ways of being. Post-nationalism prefigured is brave, and it is so at many scales. It begins from those excluded from Black nationalisms, albino, woman, queer. The argument seen is personal and vulnerable, yet from this it speaks to stakes that are planetary. In between the personal and the planetary, the book regards the everyday life of ordinary people as able to disrupt global geopolitics and academic blinders. Against the ping pong of dualist debates, Dr. Carnegie points to the dialectics of Caribbean life. We have been asked by many means, discipline among them, to receive categories through which to theorize the region, nation, race. These categories may not bear truth where they're born, and certainly fail to assist true insight when used as a lens for the familiar practices the book invited we reconsider beyond the veil of category, speculating, marronage, the sacred in Garvey's transterritoriality. Perhaps, as Dr. Carnegie observes, it is the categories that distract us from the import of the lives we engage as scholars, interstitial rather than pure, refusing and reworking spatial hierarchies. We meet speculators who traverse an archipelago divided by colonialism into, quote, a conglomerate of nation states. They move, buying and selling food and small wares, often against friction posed by formal boundaries, even though this trade is foundational to making life for so many. Through them, the book returns us to the project of Caribbean regionalism, to which we Jamaicans have a particular relationship, given our Big Island role in the infanticide of West Indian Federation. While formal transnationalism solidifies borders into, quote, the conflation of geographic space and social identity, speculators' inter-island travel nevertheless materializes Caribbean borderlands. Paradoxically, interstitially, these routines admittedly serve capital, delivering commodity chains into nooks forgotten in uneven development. But as with abolitionist theory today, post-nationalism prefigured does not demand that purity be the precursor of radical practice. Through them, itinerancy becomes place. Through ethnography of these women, and they are mostly women, we learn that relationships and repeated journeying are the infrastructures that make possible needed routine improvisation, shrouded by habits that retain opacity to state surveillance. Through historical studies, such as Julia Scott's and Marcus Rediker's, the book calls in these subaltern infrastructures as border transgressions that call on the spirit of marronage, which Carnegie sees as analogous to the racially differentiated subaltern social life that Scott calls the masterless Caribbean. The transitory is not mere movement between point A and B. Speculators show us the elaboration of this journey itself into the point. They enact archipelagic life. This long time rhizome is imperiled in part by hardening borders, rationalized by nationalism's hierarchies. I'm thinking here of the forced mobility imagined by the Dominican Republic's attempts to eject people of Haitian parentage, and the immobilization imagined by the arrest of inter-island travelers. The entrenchment of bordering practices unfolds even as the naturalness of nation is undermined by epochal threats, climate crisis, and its partner in crime, extractivism. Formal regionalism could learn something from the, quote, subaltern social geographies made by ordinary transgressive people in motion. Indeed, an insight of the book is that while nations celebrate transgressive ancestors, they do so through sanitized incorporation, severing historical critique from the historical present. Part of what undergirds this incorporation is discourse, including academic discourse, that fixes rebelliousness as historical and sedentary. Quote, what goes unnoticed in transplantations of past heroes and heroines into the present consciousness is the tension, the dialectic, between a metaphysic of the sedentary and the mobile that lies at the core of their rebellions. As someone whose research is preoccupied with the shifting line between illicit and licit, set in motion by projects that repurpose state capacities through bordering practices, a method informed by Ruth Gilmore, I appreciate the book's acknowledgement that the formal, one of those received categories, is not necessarily the protective arm of the state. What formal promises is surveillance in service of projects named or not yet imagined. Those projects may not lead to dispossession. Nevertheless, materializing the capacity to surveil passports, property titles, cadastral maps, identity cards, checkpoints, socioeconomic surveys, prefigures the category and grants the ability to mobilize that category in the future. In short, if you haven't yet, sit with Post-Nationalism Prefigured and its transnational publics. as I will try to do now in 2 cuts, building from 2 of the book's insights. The first cut looks at the quote tension between the metaphysic of the sedentary and the mobile. I take the book back with me to fieldwork in a place in Jamaica categorized as a squatter settlement. Served with eviction notices, those living there repeatedly responded, "We've always been here." The second cut thinks with an enforcer, a local government employee, who said of this same place, "There are no squatters over there." I put this in conversation with a quote from the book. Because whiteness continues to be the standard by which achievement and civilization are measured, a country that takes justifiable pride in its achievements as a Black nation state is perpetually forced to be defensive, generating as many tropes of self-contempt as images that might contribute to positive self-worth. So given the ongoing legacy of plantation land monopoly, transgressive land strategies have included a host of land tenure practices that echo the strategic flexibility, to use a phrase from the book, of speculators. Family land is an inalienable, jointly held tenure formed when a forebear bequeathed land to all his or her descendants through will or oral tradition. Jean Besson's extensive ethnographies show how Caribbean people use family land to transgress the formal property regime in order to extend an eternal stake in the land to future kin. Alongside family land have been a variety of non-property strategies for laying claim to land, durable yet insecure forms of tenure that I call not landless, but ownershipless. That was coined by Bongo Jared Small. The reemergence of the designation squatter in public policy moves towards, but does not guarantee, the eradication of such practices. Refusing dispossession, "We've always been here," reverberates with the eternal stake claimed through family land. However, though the statement seems to claim fixity, it simultaneously indexes spatial practice of varied temporalities belonging to a place, but also alighting provisionally. Many of those living on the plantation had at one time lived in the adjacent village. Refuting property boundaries, "We've always been here," asserts belonging to a place that spans then and now, village and plantation. The expanded spatio-temporality of here remaps belonging, drawing on historical geographies that tie village and plantation together into a unit scaled by routine journeys taken to make life and the collectives with whom one trod. I understand here as an alternative mapping practice incited by eviction and events preceding eviction. By plantation epistemologies, tenure to the plot is contingent on authorization by the property owner. When the ownership-less refused to move, the former landowner employers, by whom the ownership-less had been exploited for generations, was asked to verify the presumptive squatter's relation to the land. The former landowners reportedly replied, "We gave those people the land to live out their lives on." In other words, claim to land by the ownership-less had been authorized, but only for so long as they lived. With land, but without ownership of it, their tenure is durable but precarious. The expansive here asserts a claim to the land authorized not through the law, but through disobedient anti-colonial logics, belonging to place, stewardship of the land, birthright, generational birthright, exploitation and premature death on this parcel of land, belonging to nation, aesthetics of placemaking, refusing scarcity that results from property, continuous possession. None of these submit to placelessness for the next generation, nor grant an ostensible owner the authority to render one placeless. Further, the ownership-less insists on the right of return, much like distant kin return to family land. Miss S had left property to claim land on the plantation. She was dispossessed by organized abandonment. Her mother's property above the plantation became inaccessible when rainstorms destroyed the road and water service, prompting an exodus from the area. She said, "Up there can't suit us again." She had refused to be a domestic like her mother, lest someone feisty with her disrespect her. She's a higgler traveling to buy and sell at the market, which made up there with its road no more, particularly unsuitable. Legal tenure mattered less than her effort to fashion a life free of disrespect. Here stretches time and space. It is tricky, implying continuous possession, a prerequisite of gaining title by adverse possession. Continuity despite the livelihood mobility that undermines the capacity to stay in one place. As life cycle events rack up, improvisation throws one back into the initial year of possession, ruled criminal trespass. Parallel but distinct from spatiotemporalities that trigger dispossession, here is capacious enough to hold absence from the district without loss of belonging. It asserts an endurance unpunctured by journeys, sojourns, elsewheres. While here implies the ways in which life is made in the interstices of plantation past and presence, it also challenges us to reimagine the project of thinking land beyond property and after colonialism, one that embodies, quote, the tension between the metaphysic of the sedentary and the mobile. 2, the category squatter has been enumerated at anywhere from 10 to 30% of the population, demonstrating equivocation in the category's definition. I explain this as the state's anxiety about disciplining those whom capital surpluses, meaning durable yet insecure land tenure has had the effect of securing casualized labor as self-sufficient but ready at hand, with reproduction accomplished via tenure unsanctioned by law. This results from dual forces, exclusion from property and the use of space towards abolition. Despite this dialectic, the state has a stake in, I have a little bit left to go. Despite this dialectic, the state has a stake in Jamaicans having land but not ownership of it, whether that tenure status results from the refusal of or exclusion from legitimacy. I want to briefly reconsider okay, there's a story I find myself retelling about that moment, the moment of ethnography, when there's a powerful disconnect. The statement that Peter wrote down was, quote, "There are many stories." The speaker had been introduced to me as the enforcer, a civil servant in local government. The disconnect was that over there is on the list of squatter settlements compiled by the central government. I was not going to inform the enforcer that the central government had categorized the place and by extension the people over there as squatters. So how could I understand what he was saying? Who is a squatter? Initial policy making reports define squatting as, quote, the illegal or unauthorized occupation of land or housing. But the enforcer knows that squatting is not actually in the legal code. To cut a long story short, central government says that law holds local government responsible for monitoring development, defined as
construction on, above, or below the ground. But local government says building code that dictates that only construction in concrete must obtain building permits. I had been schooled by someone in the social welfare arm of the state that it was possible to read tenure status from the landscape by taking notice of material. Where tenure status is temporary, such as leased land or informal tenure, wood predominates because it is movable. But why does building material structure inspection? The historical geography of casualized labor is sedimented in the uneven regulation of construction differentiated by materials. What is inscribed in the landscape is the fluidity associated with labor mobility. In addition to those who are bound by the terms of their leases, the ownership less often build in wood without any intention to a stake in the land. It helps to evade surveillance. The central government is suggesting that the enforcer closed this loophole, one that emerged out of the conditions of labor mobility, by developing a long-standing business in long-term construction. So I will start. Okay. Right, so this the end, which is the beginning, and is toward the end of my dissertation field work, my grandmother, then living in Minneapolis with my parents, died. I left Jamaica briefly to appear at Princeton. Facing death, she was completely and utterly unafraid. Her Christian faith made her certain she would be reunited with her parents. She embraced the reality that it was her time, and even her last wheezing gasps for breath. Despite my own faith-filled upbringing, I never had such things. I had always questioned God's will, and though I was part of the youth leadership cabinet in my church when I was a senior in high school, that questioning only grew over the years. By the time I had moved to New York and become involved with what some were calling the New Harlem Renaissance, even as I was constantly moving with people for whom spirituality was a motivating force, as it also was for me, the more I learned about the global histories of dispossession, inequality, and violence, and the more I came to position my own experiences of violence in relation to these longer and more narratives, the more distant I felt from any kind of certainty related to redemption and real change. Okay. All right. Graduate school, put the final nail in that coffin, as a particular kind of critical practice overshadowed the joy, the hope, and community that I experienced in my other life as an artist, albeit a very skeptical one. Is it better? The sound? It's okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I went into Val not long after Modern Blackness had been published, and he asked me if I was really that much of a pessimist. In response to my tirade about the tyranny of the nation state and the possibility of thriving under the thumb of neoliberalism, he calmly suggested that global community was. I may have laughed out loud. Guffawed, even. Reading Post-Nationalism Prefigured again 20 years later with fresh eyes and not unfazed by the irony that I'm now engaged in the interrogation of religious spheres of world building outside of, but in relation to modern structures of the nation state, I was returned to that moment. To say that the appeal within Post-Nationalism Prefigured for an anticipatory anthropology was prescient, by vis-a-vis contemporary calls to think through potential, becoming, and refusal. There are many overlaps, I think. I said to Rachel before, I was like, are we going to say that it's prescient would be too simple. Emerging as it did when anxious preoccupations with transnationalism and globalization were swirling across the disciplines, and indeed these were the preoccupations that animated my own graduate training in the 1990s. The book both breaks with and reorients then current wisdom about the centrality of states as objects of analysis, even as scholars attempted to locate more liberatory modes of personhood in the flows beyond and between territorial borders. Val's insistence on anthropology's complicity with boundary making in the book echoes his earlier critique of the ways post-independence scholarship in West Indies turned away from ethnography to embrace developmental economics that would serve to solidify the notion that the state was the legitimate container for the aspirations of citizens. His assertion that long-term engagement with the quote, seemingly inconsequential day-to-day activities of ordinary people can give us insights into the deeply transnational and archipelagic networks that actually characterize people's economic, political, and sociocultural worlds, holds today as an argument for the value of unbounded anthropology. And of course, this critique is given flesh throughout the text. Understanding nationalism as a carceral conceptual framework, Val proceeds through Post-Nationalism Prefigured to critique the forms of intellectual containment emergent from both modern liberal and Marxist political philosophy. In doing so, he asks us to release ourselves from the thrall of liberal Western sovereignty, a thrall to which we're bound in so many ways, even as we critique its terms. And he wants us to release ourselves not through some eventful revolution, but via a recognition of the ways Caribbean people have themselves over time and across space exhibited at best an indifference to sovereignty and exclusive formulations of citizenship, even when in more recent times we're holding our flags aloft. This release occasions various deaths and in the time that remains, I want to explore three. The death of race-based notions of belonging, the death of the centrality of secularism to modern notions of political community, and the death of a particular discourse of autonomy. We have never quite shed the racialized evolutionary renderings of human development that characterized both Kant's pragmatic anthropology and the 19th century elaboration of physical anthropology. For those of us who are housed in ethnographic museums, these renderings haunt our physical and aesthetic environments. Even our reclamations are still defined. They are too specifically drawn, caught up in notions of tracking the particularities of ancestry and communities of descent. While these processes are certainly central to repatriation efforts, they do not bring about the repair. This is because, as Val shows us, they do not challenge the conceptual salience of race. The forms of classification and expectation that undergird and reproduce race thinking link blood, skin, and territory in insidious ways, as he so deftly shows in his classic essay, Madonna's Definition. The albino, Val argues, demonstrates the limits not only of white supremacist racial classificatory schema, because she undoes these things, but also of essentialist identity politics. She, quote, brings into simultaneous focus the disenfranchisement created by the unchecked operation of the race nation educational system of essential models as a way of arresting or reversing this process. Appealing to Blackness as value must constantly contend with Blackness as barbarism. Reversal does not bring about liberation, precisely because the appeal and reversal uphold the binarisms upon which Black liberation is founded. I was reminded here of Denise Ferreira da Silva's refusal of dialectics and the broader premises of modern thought and her mathematical computations of Blackness, value, and life. Understanding Western philosophical conceptualizations of determinacy as causation and of the world as an effect of determination, Ferreira da Silva arrives at a notion of determinacy after Kant, which presumes a universal that operates as a formal force, and which also produces objects whose relations to the universal are measured and judged, resulting in scientific accounts of human difference along the lines of racial and cultural difference, themselves unmoored from the transnational and social developments producing wealth for Europe in the colonies. Within this context, she argues, Blackness both marks and obscures the violence of these categorizations, but also has the capacity to, quote, unravel modern thought without reproducing the violence housed in knowledge and in the scene of value. This is because, as she shows by moving through a series of binaristic mathematical calculations in which Blackness -1 is combined with, subtracted from, and multiplied by life +1, itself ultimately divided by the nullified form of life mixed with Blackness 0, we ultimately arrive at infinity. It's a very complicated set of equations, but if you go to the essay and work it out, it's quite interesting. Ferreira da Silva argues that Blackness as infinity, as matter outside of the dialectic, disrupts the time and space of modernism and opens a portal to another kind of world. This is also, for Val, what Garvey's Black Star Line did. In deterritorializing race and in untethering notions of racial value from secular modernist conceptualization of community, Blackness became infinite possibility. Of course, it's critically important that this possibility was enabled through a religious conception of history, which brings me to the second death of the secular rationality. Val's position is that Garvey appealed to modernist aspirations while also having to acknowledge that young people globally were actively prevented from realizing those aspirations. This meant that in the same breath, he had to also appeal to divine authority to the prevailing order, a sleight of hand that would not have been unfamiliar to those hailed by his vision. As Val writes, quote, religious ideas and the rhetoric of religion became central to clarifying an alternative, morally grounded politics, to building an organization and to advancing a set of economic programs. What is key here, I think, is not only the refusal of the sacred secular binary, but also the assertion that modes of religious expression and experience buttress the articulation and management of development programs. The realm of the spiritual is what hails followers. The familiar verse in Matthew that the last will be first and the first last offered a promise for repair in the hereafter. Yet given that so much has been written about the ways Abrahamic religions since their foundation have reinforced onto-epistemological, racialized, and gender distinctions among followers, it's no surprise that thou would have elsewhere. Pursuing Baha'i teachings and paradigms marks thou's own rejection, not only of the sacred secular binary, but also the local global one. It is through Baha'i understanding and practice, he argues, that one might relinquish an exclusivist commitment to place, and thus of the nexus race-like territory, and instead cultivate an understanding of the oneness of humanity, a quote, condition of global belonging, he writes, that nurtures the positive features of localized patriotic attachments, that does away with the fundamental contradictions inherent in the present nation-state order, end quote. Given the various alternatives, spiritual and socio-political, that were being engaged by ordinary Jamaicans during the 1950s, it seems unremarkable that former Garveyans would be drawn to the Baha'i paradigm, just as many were also drawn to the various versions of Rastafari that were circulating at the time. The Baha'i vision, Val argues, quote, points to the inadequacy of our Western models of religion for understanding the significance of this global community. Indeed, the inadequacy of Western paradigms to enable transformative care for each other and for the earth and non-human others has been a more recent theme of Caribbean anthropology. Whether by addressing how Orisha Ifa practitioners in Trinidad and Tobago reimagine belonging to a community, to a political territory, secular world, by building on earlier Pan-African circulations, I'm thinking about Castro's work, or by advancing an understanding of Obeah's process of experimentation that disrupts the opposition between tradition and innovation in Western modernity in order to enact justice outside of the normative realm of the juridical, and I'm thinking the Brent question, or by charting the conditions that are necessary for the realization of queer freedoms and Black sovereignties within the context of African states and their animal flora. These scholars are reorienting our understandings of the relations among the political, the spiritual, and the sensual. And in doing so, they indict state sovereignty in crisis for its inability to accommodate what Adriana Lopez calls an anti-nostalgic human and non-human assemblage. Assemblages like the collaborations currently developing with farmers and artists in Puerto Rico that she understands as forms of decolonial resurgence. The indigenous spiritualities that inform this resurgence also refuse the modern juridical boundaries designed to include them. Which brings me to the third death, that of the discourse of autonomy. This is a discourse rooted in settledness, which is the site of both Val's most trenchant critiques and his most evocative interventions throughout Post-Nationalism Prefigured. We are asked, for example, to consider an ethos of Armand that extends far beyond settled communities of runaways into a wider dynamic of trans-frontier mobility and fugitivity. We are confronted with Black sailors and inter-island traders who exploit the vulnerabilities of planters, colonial officials, and nationalist policymakers who are constantly trying to constrict the mobility upon which they nonetheless depend. We come to apprehend the modernity of control and containment as continually one or two steps behind the counter-modernity of subalterns. In Val's words, these subalterns create a quote, loosely articulated infrastructure and institutional complex, as much urban as rural and grounded in actual and potential relationships. A complex, quote, whose recognition significantly alters present-day political perspectives tied to fixed notions of race and territory. He shows us, in other words, that the plot constantly exceeds the space and time of the plantation, and that autonomy is rooted not in the race, nation, character, triad, but in the everyday movements across and within it. Val calls this strategic flexibility, a term that for him, quote, refers to a set of cultural understandings that can be used to counter the ideological demands of exclusive national sovereignty. Strategic flexibility evokes both an attitude of expectancy, through which one might be able to take advantage of whatever opportunity comes along, and the building of multiple future trajectories to buffer against the insecurity generated by putting all of one's eggs in the same basket. The insights in post-nationalism prefigured are built upon fieldwork conducted throughout the last 3 decades of the 20th century. So part of the point of revisiting a text 20 years later is to think through what it might offer us today as we confront contemporary realities. If post-nationalism prefigured was sounding the death knell for a particular conceptual framing of sovereignty, the one rooted in Western liberal Enlightenment visions grounded in indigenous racial slavery, the one that privileges sedentary modes of living and tracking belonging, then what new framings might be imaginable today? I'll offer one, and David's already heard me talk about this. So I've been interested in the thinking through surrender. Surrender, like sovereignty, has etymological roots in law and territorial possession or expansion. But it also indexes the action of yielding one's person or giving up possession of something, especially into the power of another. This giving up refers not only to property or territory, but also to giving oneself over to something, as in a spirit or an ancestor, or a belief or movement. Surrender, in this sense, becomes less juridical, more relational, something that requires practice and attunement. It's performative and processual. It requires witnesses and generates archives, and it lays out political and social possibilities beyond the forms of recognition on offer by the nation state. It is, like strategic flexibility, grounded in relationships and in a troubling of modernist understanding space. So whether working with the Charlestown Maroon community or with practitioners of Kumina or with women in central Jamaica who are protesting the extension of the South Coast Highway, or with people in Tivoli Gardens still struggling with the aftermath of the 2010 incursion, my sense is that thinking through surrender can provide a way to envision a mode of relational sovereignty unanchored to a state, one that is constituted through future-oriented iterative practice that is enacted in the state. An earlier generation of Caribbean scholars already knew that the contradictions facing people around the world would not be transcended by aspiring to control the state. They thus offered repetition, recursivity, and relation, rather than linearity, teleology, and hierarchy, as the grounds for the wretched to think political possibilities. What Val shows us is that ordinary Caribbean people have always already been living these possibilities, and this is the gift of post-nationalism prefigured.
We could try the we'll see.
Should I say testing 1, 2, 3?
Yeah.
All right, hello everyone. How are you? Thanks for listening. And I have to shift my gears because, Professor Goffe and the comments has given me so much food for thought. It's difficult to bring myself back to my own thoughts and words today, but I'll try. But first, I'd like to thank Dr. Cummings and Dr. Matthew Chin, and also Dr. Njelle Hamilton for organizing the symposium. It's really an amazing event. And it's a wonderful opportunity for me to see old friends, of course, and to meet new colleagues and reflect on a book and a relationship that has meant a lot to me personally and professionally. Of course, there's a lot one can say about Post-Nationalism Prefigured. One can talk at length, for example, about its careful and capacious scholarship, which ranges from close-up studies of St. Lucian speculators and their informal inter-island trading networks, to parsing the references to race and albinism in colonial-era treatises, to a reassessment of Guardian light of his ability to enact a politics of transnational solidarity. One can talk as well about the book's deep ethical commitments to centering the voices and experiences of working-class Caribbean people, dismantling systems of oppression based on normative constructs of gender, sexuality, as well as race, and imagining new forms of political and religious unity. And obviously, my colleagues have done a good job of opening up some of those those parts of the book already. My reflections today will focus on the personal and the anecdotal as a way of teasing out a critical thread within the book that has been particularly resonant and generative for my work, as well as the work of other Caribbean scholars. In chapter 1 of Post-Nationalism Prefigured, Carnegie makes a brilliant, and I would add, narrative use of a personal anecdote. Readers of the book, I'm sure, will readily recall the incident, which takes place, as Carnegie so vividly describes, quote, on a warm August morning at a public beach in Montego Bay, end quote. In the account, the reverie of a solitary swim in the, quote, deliciously warm water, end quote, of the Caribbean Sea is broken first by the jarring sound of a passing speedboat, and then more faithfully and with more devastating psychological consequences by the objectifying gaze and disparaging conversation of a close-by lifeguard and his male friend. Carnegie recounts in exacting and personally painful autoethnographic detail the seemingly casual insult and humiliation he is forced to endure as the lifeguard and his friend debate between themselves as if he was not within earshot, the putative race of his parents, the defectiveness of his eyesight, questioning in effect his social fitness, if not his very humanity. The original experience was clearly deeply wounding, even traumatic for Carnegie. His recollection in the book surely constituted a reopening of the psychic wound and a re-traumatizing of the lifelong injury resulting from being seen or unseen, as it were, as an aberration of nature, the racial anomaly represented by the figure of the so-called Dundas. Nevertheless, Carnegie leverages this painful episode to mount a highly effective critique of the race nation imaginary. He demonstrates the untenability and dangers of upholding Blackness or any racial construct as the foundation of national identity by tracing the ideological and discursive underpinnings of the cultural stereotypes surrounding the figure of the Dundas in the writings of Thomas Jefferson and Edward Long, as well as the ethnopolitics that characterize Jamaica and other post-colonial Caribbean states. In Carnegie's words, quote, the Jamaican Dundas and albinism more broadly are symbolic forms embedded in a wider social discourse whose geographical and temporal boundaries shift from Jamaica to the wider Caribbean, to the United States, and from the late 18th century to the present. The marginalized position of the Dundas and the taboos surrounding them offer a site from which to question the inclusiveness that collectivities of race and nation claim, end quote. I want to play out a little further the implications of Carnegie's critique of racial essentialism, as well as the interpersonal dynamics of the anecdote. But in order to do so, I have to return to an earlier moment before the publication of Post-Nationalism Prefigured in 2002 to my first job after graduate school as an assistant professor of English at Bates College. I met Val Carnegie on a snowy day in Lewiston, Maine. It must have been in the winter of 1992 at a reception following my job talk. Val reached out to me as a fellow Jamaican, and his openness and generosity played no small part in my decision to accept the position. Val and a small group of like-minded faculty provided community, camaraderie, and intellectual and spiritual sustenance for a pre-tenure faculty member of color uneasily ensconced in the unfamiliar and at times alienating confines of the PWI. My interest in thinking through the limitations of the nation as a construct for organizing the study of literary texts, especially literary texts that do not fit neatly within one national canon or another, resonated with Val's work on inter-island traders and other examples of what he calls in the book trans-territorial itinerant aspects of Caribbean life. Looking back at conversations we shared over meals, during walks around Andrews Lake, or leisurely hikes in the Thorn Crag Nature Sanctuary, I can see that the seeds of post-nationalism prefigured were nurtured in those years in the early and mid-1990s, when we as Caribbean scholars were grappling with a turn towards diaspora and transnationalism that reoriented our respective disciplines in the wake of seminal texts such as Gilroy's The Black Atlantic and earlier Anderson's Imagined Communities and the work of Stuart Hall, to name but a few. My reflections on post-nationalism prefigured take me back as well to the Bates short-term courses Val and I co-taught off campus in Jamaica. These short-term courses ran for 6 weeks or so, during which we led small cohorts of undergraduates on an extended field trip / study abroad experience. For the students, the short term in Jamaica represented an opportunity to travel, learn about, and no doubt party in an exotic third world locale. For us, it was a chance to visit home, reconnect with family, friends, Jamaican colleagues, an opportunity to teach outside the Bates box, as it were, but also part research trip and laboratory for observing in situ the kinds of cultural and racial border crossings we were theorizing and writing about. I want to highlight my recollection of a seemingly inconsequential moment that transpired on one of our trips to Jamaica as an analog of sorts to the personal anecdote Carnegie deploys to such striking effect in Post-Nationalism Prefigured. If I am misremembering the context or any of the details of the incident, only Val would know. And I can claim poetic license since I'm a literary scholar anyway. In any case, in my mind's eye, Val and I were engaged in a leisurely conversation, enjoying the warm sunshine, which must have been especially welcome after the chill of another Maine winter, on the waterfront of the old downtown. The calm waters of Kingston Harbor extended before us. Val's son Hussein, who must have been 7 or 8 years old at the time, scampered in and out of the space between us and around us in some high-energy version of Ring Around the Rosie or London Bridge. The Bates students we were chaperoning were nearby, but out of eyesight, browsing at the craft market perhaps, or getting lunch from the street vendors whose carts were lined up along the waterfront. I was not so engrossed in our conversation that I was unaware we were being observed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, a quote-unquote local in his early 20s at most, dressed not in office attire or laborer's clothes, but in the casual, informal style of the day. As a Chinese Jamaican, albeit one who had not lived in Jamaica for an extended period of time since immigrating with my family to the States in 1967, I had a certain sensitivity to public visibility and attention. The act of being seen for Chinese Jamaicans, if I may venture a generalization based more on personal and familial experience rather than hard data, is undeniably fraught with risk, danger, pain, shame, guilt, as well as longing, love, and desire. Subjection to the public gaze in Jamaican culture is fraught for Chinese Jamaicans as it is for Jamaicans born with albinism. But that fraughteness is also different as a result of the highly specific ways histories of race, ethnicity, colonialism, class, and culture in the region condition how Chinese Jamaicans and Jamaicans born with albinism experience the public gaze. Suffice it to say, in a recollected situation, I was aware of being sized up quickly and astutely evaluated in relation to a whole host of identity markers to determine if the observer could perhaps gain some advantage or benefit by interacting with me. If we were tourists, as our American clothing and paraphernalia perhaps indicated, was there a service, tour guide, native informant, or product, homegrown or manufactured, he might sell or procure for us? We were used to such offers of service and products and told our American students to expect it and try to suggest wasteful, useful ways of declining as a consequence of structural underemployment and the economic political relationship of clientelism existing between Jamaica and the US. But I was also aware of, and even more critically attuned to in retrospect, the subtle and not so subtle ways in which Val and I were not so easily read. In his book, Carnegie demonstrates the problem the Jamaican born with albinism poses for an ideological system grounded in racial essentialism. The Jamaican with albinism fails or refuses to produce the visible sign of race in a system that insists on the legibility of race as a condition of belonging. Carnegie also points out the similar, though not identical, problem Jamaicans of Chinese descent pose for an ideological system predicated on a black-white binary. Although Jamaicans of Chinese descent can ostensibly produce the sign of race, that sign is not legible in the terms of the system and therefore cannot serve as a guarantor of belonging. If the Jamaican born with albinism and the Jamaican of Chinese descent are seen at all in the public culture, such seeing amounts to a gross misrecognition at best and results in dehumanizing negation in effect. They can only be seen, in other words, reductively, negatively, as the Dundas and the Chinaman. Now, in this case, such reductive seeing in the local context might have been overlaid, partially contradicted perhaps, or inadvertently complicated by other signs of public social legibility, markers of economic or class status, education, nationality, the aforementioned American clothing and gear, the academic conversation, unfamiliar accents, and so on. Our observer must have calculated some degree of discrepancy between our legibility in the local context and other signs of foreignness, extra locality. He eventually approached, positioning himself to face and address me rather than Val, for some reason. Maybe I read as more foreign or tourist than Val. Maybe the racial ambiguity of the Black albino appeared less anomalous, or maybe more to the point, less exploitable than the ambiguously foreign Chinaman. He asked, "Is Chin is where you're from?" using his body to subtly separate me from Val. When Val interjected, he was curt, dismissive in his reply. "I'm not talking to you, man." Searching for the right linguistic register to signal my Jamaicanness, I called on a never really forgotten, but still seldom used accent. "No, man, I'm born right here in Kingston." I imagine my performance of locality was not entirely convincing. Our observer continued his efforts to draw me away, growing more insistent that I follow him as there was something he wanted to show me. He became more aggressive when I declined, and it took considerable effort, not to mention Val's measured but firm intervention, to finally extricate myself from the interaction. In Post-Nationalism Prefigured, Carnegie uncovers the irreconcilable contradictions inherent in the race-nation construct, contradictions that continue to create and sustain exclusions in spite of the state-sanctioned rhetoric of multiracialism, out of many one people. Carnegie points out that in addition to the contradictions of race exposed by the figure of the Dundas, analogous exclusions are produced around the axes of gender and sexuality. He cites the work of M. Jackie Alexander on the state regulation of sexuality in Trinidad and the Bahamas, for example, to elaborate this point. I want to speculate on another dimension of the foregoing reminiscence in order to tease out potential implications along these lines of gender and sexuality. Whether or not, or to what extent such considerations figured in the perception of our local observer is not really the point. Considerations, conclusions based on perceptions of gender and sexuality are obviously ubiquitous in Jamaican culture, as they are in all contemporary societies. More to the point, the social consequences of such considerations are often damaging, even deadly, for those perceived to lie outside the norm. Is it plausible that our observers saw in me and Val, in the animation and intellectual charge of our conversation and the intimacy of our collegial relation, a same-sex couple and an interracial one at that? And to complete the picture of this non-conforming family, what did our observer make of Hussein, the energetic brown-skinned boy circling Val and me, our child? Perhaps by adoption, certainly not biological, if markers such as race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality are understood as tokens of the same. Could he have seen, in other words, not just the Chinaman and the Dundas, but the Chinaman, Dundas, Batiman, and their picnic? Fortunately for us, perhaps, if such queer musings played a part in how Val and I were seen by our observer, they were either subconscious or superseded by other more immediate and opportunistic concerns. In a 1997 article, Bullers and Batiman, I attempted a critical intervention in the discourse surrounding gay and lesbian sexuality in Jamaican popular culture and Caribbean literature. Part of the challenge was establishing a position from which to articulate a critique of homophobia that avoided the impasse of a dichotomous split between local and foreign, indigenous and metropolitan, and so on. In the article, I quoted a line from an unpublished paper Val was kind enough to share with me at the time that emblematized the wisdom and necessity of such a position. Quote, even as we seek to restore indigenous knowledge systems, we must simultaneously seek to sharpen and indigenous criticism, end quote. For me, Val Carnegie's book was an eloquent enactment of precisely the kind of criticism he had called for in the paper. Post-Nationalism Prefigured exemplified and participated in a reinvigorated, i.e. rigorous, compelling, methodologically and ideologically nuanced Caribbean critical discourse that emerged in the late 1990s, early 2000s. In addition to Val's book, the work of the distinguished scholars present at this symposium, Deborah Thomas, David Scott, and the publication circulation of small acts belong to the same milieu. Post-Nationalism Prefigured also cleared a critical space for contemporaneous and subsequent Caribbean scholarship. I'm thinking in particular of the way in which both the theoretical interventions Carnegie makes in the book and the practical collegial encouragement, and this is a running theme, I think, in the comments, he has frequently offered how they facilitated my own attempts to articulate the complicated, ambivalent, fraught relationship between Chinese Jamaicans, Jamaican culture, nationalism, and race. I'm thinking also of the way this particular piece of the critical work has been taken up and moved forward by younger scholars like Matthew Chin, right, whose articles have demonstrated how anti-homosexuality was imbricated in the early formation of Jamaican post-colonial nationalism, and how a contemporary Chinese Jamaican, Larry Chang, played a defining role in the creation of a local Caribbean gay rights movement. This critical work, which is clearly far from done, brings us closer perhaps to a day when we can all be seen, regardless of the degree to which we conform or fail to conform to normative constructs of race, gender, sexuality, religious belief, and so on, whether in the nation or post-nation, for who we are. Thank you.
So David and Buzz, we're gonna step the other mic as well. So you don't have to hold a mic. That's not really poetic. Let me see. Move it here.
Which one is it? Oh no. Immerse? No. You have to do, I think you have to do it on yours. Let me.
Yes. Be expected.
Or is the mic? Just need to say something.
And can you hear at this level of speaking? Yes. Is this okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, ad-lib. I'm not sure what exactly we say ad-lib. Well, I'm not sure if it's appropriate in an ad-lib moment to say thank you, but I just I'm blown away by this event and just want to give enormous thank you to Matthew and Ronald and Njelle and colleagues, Njelle and Tim, and you folks for coming out to this occasion. I'm not used to these celebrated events, but it's been enormously gratifying. And thank you so much. Wait, talk louder. Well, similarly, this being the occasion that is a lot. So we just press it on louder then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Very intimate.
Yeah. We will. So to me, we'll just you all in the present audience can just pretend that you're hard of hearing. we'll all act out the drama of an audience who is likely, senior citizens who need hearing aids but have come by them. But soon will be. Echo. To Ronald, Matthew, Njelle, for organizing the event. It's hard to think about Caribbean scholar, Jamaican scholar, more deserving of this kind of critical listening as well as critical appreciation
than capitalism. I have known for a large number of years, since 1991 or thereabouts. And it's a great privilege for me here among all of you and to be in this kind of conversation with my dear friend and colleague. So what I thought that since we are squashed into 40 minutes of in terms of time, what I thought I tried to do are two things. To spend the first 20 minutes, then I will ask somebody in the audience, perhaps when we're at about 20 minutes, to talk a little bit with Val about his intellectual formation, which is intriguing and fascinating and important for us to think about and think through. And to use the second 20 minutes to talk about one of the projects which was mentioned in the introductory remarks, Val's long-standing critique, recognize of Caribbean and Jamaican nationalism, and to think partly the prehistory of the making of the nationalist project. So that's what we're going to do. So to begin with, Val, give thanks first of all for agreeing to this conversation, and I'm not intentionally embarrassed. I want to begin with Jamaica College, where we were students, the late 1960s, early 1970s. Can you give us a briefly, given our time constraints, a sense of what Jamaica College was like in a period of enormous political ferment in the 1960s, early 1970s?
Well, maybe I can start with just the spatial. So, for those of David and I both attended this place as students at different, a few years in between. But many of you in the room and watching don't know the place. So it is a Jamaican high school, one of the early endowed places that in the early 20th century, have somehow, and I should have reviewed this history before coming here, but acquired this large piece of land in a very prime location in Kingston. So it is probably as big spatially as a college campus, and intimidating in that respect. I mean, they've sold off land in the interim to create various. It's now a fully government assisted school, but it has its own land endowment and a cadre of students who are very prominently placed, who ensure that its privilege continues. So it's a big place, a privileged place, and an intimidating place for a hierarchical place comprised of little boys and big boys. Okay, and little boys become big boys partly through you climb the hierarchy even in your little boyhood through sports and through, right? So it's a space that I come into as someone recently moved to Kingston, a little boy in this big space, in this hierarchical space, very intimidating. And then, I'm on the margins of being a little boy. And so, yeah, so this is a little bit of sketching of the context. Now, it also was a place of well, I've implied this already, a place of privilege. At the time when I come in 1963, perhaps, so it's a colonial space, perhaps a third maybe of the teaching staff is still British. And our first headmaster is a brown Jamaican, but after him, the board appoints a Welshman for several years as the headmaster to try to bring back discipline and bring back the old JC and so on. So this is a place that is in transition in independent Jamaica with an opening up of opportunities through education, more Black students, more people of well, mostly Black middle class, but some working class Jamaican families having opportunities to come into this space through government aided scholarship programs and so on, and increased funding of education. So it's still a place where white and light-skinned Jamaica is accustomed to being, and Black-skinned Jamaicans, as I say, are newly arrived in large numbers and are making their way. So in a way, on the surface, it pretends to be an egalitarian. It exhibits itself as an egalitarian space, much like private white institutions in this country, the University of Virginia or Bates College, where I've taught for years. You don't announce, class doesn't announce itself loudly. It is just there. It is part of the institutional fabric. But and it appears as an accepted. So part of the way in which you assert yourself is through sports, is through excelling, and then the interactions with your white peers and light-skinned peers are there's a kind of equalizing going on. In the wider society, which is I think part of what David is trying, it's a part of that movement that's happening within the school and outside. By the end of the decade, that teaching staff ratio becomes mostly Black Jamaican. Yeah. Where do I want to go?
So before you we're not this space rather than the personal story.
No, I like the personal story because it's in. So as I said, I'm even more marginal than the rest of the little boys. Okay, and in various ways, not only in terms of skin color that I stand out, but more distressingly for me, because of limited eyesight. You see, I can't negotiate a lot of these other things, like the classroom, for example. In those junior, Blackboard subjects, things that happen largely on Blackboard, mathematics, the sciences in particular. Even if I'm sitting in the front row where you guys are, it's very hard to read a Blackboard. And so there's very little accommodation happening. And so once or twice in my, first form, which is your entering form, I mean, my parents had to kind of try to negotiate that. Unfortunately, I have a cousin who's teaching on the staff, who, but it never quite gets negotiated to my satisfaction. But so you undergo both the humiliation of always having to sit in the front row, because the cool people never sit in the front row, right? But also clearly still struggling, even though you're sitting in the front row of a classroom, right? But also in sports, not being able to play team sports especially, but even track and field. You know, I mean, you know, sort of. So where am I? You know, even track and field. You know, trying to run from here to where. You know, I mean, not being able to clearly see the finish line. So, but also even in sharing for your school teams or even your house teams. So you're organized into houses. You know, junior houses and senior houses. I don't know if it was there, but yeah. So they have sports days and the houses compete and blah 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 blah. But so it was a very intimidating place for me. And so I'm experiencing my otherness in this space in multiple ways, spatially, hierarchically, being on the outside of the little board.
I mean, that was one of the reasons I begin with Val's high school and secondary school is not only to, you know, as a place of beginning of a kind of social awareness, but I don't know how many of you know that the Carnegie in Jamaica is the family of education. There are a large number of times I was taught at Jamaica College by two Carnegie. My sister was taught at St. Hugh's High School by a Carnegie. It's the family. In Jamaica, the Carnegie family is known the family of education. So the place of education and story of Val's formation, I think, is a really very important one. Val, at the end of secondary school, you don't go. It's about 1971.
Yeah.
Interestingly, you don't go to UE.
I do for a year.
You do,
Yeah.
and then you go to Cornell. How is that decision made?
Oh, it happened inadvertently to Cornell. So I started at UWI and I started because it was more economical to live at home. So I was commuting. And so I felt on the outside of the campus at Mona. You know, everything happens on campus, hall life, carnival, all of the parties, you know. And then I'm in the social sciences, and at a time when the social sciences are very you have to specialize really early, and I kind of wanted just all my life to kind of be reading literature as well as sociology and doing it. I mean, my subject in sixth form at JC was economics. Yes, I neglected to mention that by the latter years of high school, I was much more comfortable, and that sixth form at JC, the last 2 years of JC were like a college campus. It was very much you're left on your own, unsupervised, and very, very telling, very, very socially conscious discussions happening. So some of my peers at that time would have been Bryan Hall, for example, the anthropology, the political scientist, and a number of people who have become two governors of the Bank of Jamaica were, Derek Latibaudier and now Richard Giles, peers, at JC of this time. So people go, but yeah, it's the UWI. But I'm become more comfortable at JC, but UWI is a more awkward space in that first year, partially because I'm not living on campus and experiencing in some ways as an outsider commuter, which is much more common these days. People working and going to college at UWI, but then was less so. So I did the first year, then I took a year off and worked with our government department, the Jamaica Information Service. And at the end of that year, there was a scholarship advertised to Cornell, which I applied for and got. So that's the short version.
Years of enormous work in Jamaica, years of very strong non-traditional platform. They're running events. They generation of mathematics, rise, the leadership of Post-National Housing, etc. What are you involved in? How do you think about your own political, emerging political and cultural consciousness in this period?
Right. Well, the period is transitional in many ways. There's a discussion that I know has happened with Charles Mills's work between Charles and Bryan Meeks, for example, where Charles, the philosopher recently passed, the author of The Racial Contract, you know, who was a few years ahead of me at JC, and Bryan was much more sort of actively sort of politically conscious in school. Charles less so. The family, the member of a kind of academic university, brown-skinned university family. You know, Charles was doing physics, reading science fiction, and on the edges of this movement. Bryan much more involved. Yeah, so those that Bryan and my years, we were, I mean, so the JC magazine, which is an annual publication that I don't know if still does, but used to come out, and you know, the senior class be very involved in putting it together, and would have poetry, short written pieces, essays by some of the senior class and so on. In my year, for example, I wrote an essay, which I mean, I'd hate to go back to look at, but was called Why Black Power. Right, that's one response to your question. So, you know, Bryan would have published in it. Jerry Small, who was quoted, I think, this right morning, would have published in it. Jerry was, you know, a few years ahead, the son of the first black high court judge in Jamaica. So there were, you know, and as I said, those sixth form discussions were very much about questions of social change and revolutionary social change, Rastafari, all of that stuff. You know, critical positioning in relation to the middle class from which most of us sprang, and so on and so on. So I was very much, you know, involved in that, but yeah.
All I know talk to us a little bit about and in particular, when did you think that anthropology was in your future? How do you come back in those years, around 1970, to imagine that anthropology, which is not necessarily very widespread among Jamaican scholars of your generation or mine, how do you come to
Right. Well, and just but the big afro would have come out of the article Why Black Power. I mean, my year at UW, I remember wearing a ham. So sometimes it was on the afro, and sometimes it was covered by a rasta tam. Cornell and anthropology, I just happened into anthropology, of course. So because at UWI there, it wasn't that distinct. It was folded into sociology as much as British anthropology. You know, British social anthropology was much more aligned with sociology, and at UWI they were folded into the same department. So I didn't know that as a distinct discipline, having done the first year of the social sciences at Mona. And then at Cornell, I just kind of, I started out thinking, oh, maybe sociology might be a possible major. And the first and only sociology course I took at Cornell was a Tucker Parsons, a course taught by a Tucker Parsons student. And it was dreary, it was awful. And then I just happened the next semester into an anthropology course taught by, Victor Turner, when he came to the United States from Manchester first, was at Cornell. And if you know his first book, The Farce of Symbols, and the subsequent, his next book were published by Cornell University Press. He had recently left Cornell by the time I came, I think maybe the year before or something. I came for Chicago, and then of course he came to UVA, to Virginia, where I later met him briefly many years later in person. But there was an anthropology faculty professor at Cornell, Bernd Lambert, who was of German-American background, who was just a wonderfully sensitive, he was a scholar of Oceania, kinship. But he taught this course, which he inherited from Victor Turner, Literature and so on. And that was my first anthropology course. And that was just, it was spellbinding. So I guess I start out loving anthropology from Victor Turner through Bernd Lambert. And somehow, in retrospect, I think what's happening is that I'm seeing in anthropology this, it's in a way, and I come out of otherness, right? The JC experience of, so instead of being, or your first reaction is to be beaten down by this otherness. Is it 20 minutes? Oh. but then, how do you so I think my career has been a learning and the learning the value of being able to reverse the gaze and to see the center as the problem, right? No, the problem is not me. It's right. It's the models that you all have and that you all live through, right? And so I think, in retro, I wouldn't have seen it in that way then, but it seemed, but I think that's what anthropology held for me, and getting introduced to it through literature and through Turner's work allowed me to sort of, the liminal as this productive space. Yeah.
I'm going to give at Cornell, so as a graduate student, and you go to an anthropology department, which has not long been formed by Richard Franson, who was the founder and who came afterwards, but what is it that draws you? Are you drawn to that particular department? Are you casting around for departments? Right. Something about these two figures who have recently come from here to build an anthropology department with a Caribbean and Atlantic focus that draws you to it.
Yeah, I almost got to do. It happened through. So Bernd Lambert also turned out to be my academic advisor, and he was aware of. I think he encouraged me to apply to graduate school. He was aware of this new department forming. He gave me off his shelf a copy of Sidney Nips's Caribbean Transformations as a gift, and he kind of encouraged me to apply. So I really only applied to two places. I think Teachers College, where Lambros Comitas was, and Hopkins. And I was, so it was the first year of them accepting graduate students. So the department had formed the year before, but this was the entering, in the entering class and a small cohort of graduate students. So in a way, the choice was kind of made for me. And I think Bernd, because in his kinship course, which I did after the myth ritual course, I had done a paper on Caribbean kinship that had me interviewing Caribbean students at Cornell. So I hadn't talked about the contingent of a very intellectually and socially active Caribbean student cohort at Cornell at the time. Wonderful parties and discussions, and the Africana Studies Center, headed by James Turner, facilitated it, and it had a the Africana Studies Center had a diasporic focus and facilitated that kind of dialogue. So I remember, for example, well, I should tell you some of the people who were, so the graduate student cohort included, say, Patrick and Trevor Farrell, the economist, who went to St. Augustine and worked with Trinidad government, Alan Williams, another economist, George Nelson, of a large Jamaican dreadlocks who was loud and occupied the Cornell campus in ways that, I mean, he just completely turned everything on its head. And George and his wife at the time, Yvonne, would have, you know, very wonderful parties. This is big. So we were participating in the 1970s awakening in Jamaica at a distance and listening to all of that reggae at George's and Yvonne's parties and eating Jamaican food. And yeah, so that was Cornell. And so I did this paper, it was a kinship paper for Brian Lambert's course, where I was interviewing my fellow Caribbean students, and you know, the ways in which Caribbean kinship seeps across borders, not only geographic borders, but the ways in which kinship is extended, where kids get raised by people who aren't their biological parents, where, you know, you call, you know, this person aunt and uncle, you know, so it seeps through the boundaries, and so that's I think. So if you my later work, you can kind of see threads of it coming through that history. So that I think, you know, I think Brian probably saw the potential there, and his work was on kinship in Oceania, in not the Andaman Islands, but and similar Polynesian. Yeah, not a kinship preoccupation, but a certain kind of wanting to see across the boundaries of these categories.
What was Hopkins like in those years?
Hopkins, like UVA, yes, a genteel Southern institution, right? And its quad is a shorter version of this one up here. The anthropology department represented, I think, that first moment of trying to shift. So it was a small department. Hopkins had one or two anthropologists in I think the geography department before, but this was a first independent department. It was a small department, like most many Hopkins departments, for maybe 6 full-time faculty, adjuncts, and then one adjunct, Bill Sturdivant, who was at the Smithsonian, and distinguished visiting people, Edmund Leach, Levi Strauss, and so on, came through for a semester at the time, and so on and so on. It started with Mellon funding, I think, and you know, all of the graduate students were generously funded. It was a small incoming cohort, and in relation to Hopkins, a genteel white Southern institution, there were very few black graduate students. Hopkins in our entering class, right, of maybe 5 well, the entering, so they had an entering class that was fresh out of undergrad. Then they had a few more senior people who they brought from Yale, who had started their graduate programs at Yale, Aaron Ronald, Scott Harris, who later became an editor at Cambridge University Press instead of sticking with anthropology, because it doesn't come up in anthropology circles. So she's an academic press person. But the first year cohort, those of us who were coming just from undergrad, had like, of the 5 or 6 of us, maybe 3 or 4 Black people. Yeah, and that's for Rolf and Brackett came in like the next year. So that first year, it would have been Don Billingsley, an African American who was a great presence, who spoke fluent German and French. And Don was the character. And then he learned Wolof and studied fieldwork in Senegal. He became a dean at Yale for a while, and then he went off back to Paris and headed the American school in Paris. John Don was a larger than life character. Dressed, he had his suits tailor-made in most war. Don, Trevor Purcell, myself, and Lucia Desir, who was of Colombian background, born in Providencia, fluent Spanish speaker, Colombian, married to a Haitian doctor and trained in history first, and became in anthropology. So we were conspicuously different than the rest of the Hopkins campus. Like Hopkins, there were very few Black faculty, and very few departments had more than one Black graduate student, if that. Most of the Black people on campus were working custodial and dining service jobs. Yeah. So it was that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. So there's much to say.
Well, maybe I should just yeah. So the history of the department. So two published sources that you can look to are one, my interview with Sid Mintz in Small Acts number 19, and Richard Price has a wonderful new memoir that's just coming out this month, I think, called Inside Outside, that treats the beginning years at Hopkins from a different lens, and that David has said, there are different versions of that. So you can see 2 versions in published work.
But I want to shift gears to turn to there's a lot of insightful comments that we made about Prefigured. And I remember that book, reading of that book, and as though they were written and being discussed yesterday. But I want to talk about one of the questions about the making of the nationalist project in Jamaica that I know has exercised you for a number of years in the wake of Post-Nationalism Prefigured. And that has to do with the collapse of the making of an expansive civil society out of Jamaica welfare, for example, or out of various kinds of attempts to produce nuanced, informed, complicated institutions of a public sphere from the end of the 1920s, in some sense, to the 1930s. and in some way the takeover of the nationalist project by the kind of two-party political system that eviscerates and downplays the importance of civil society. So I want to hear you talk a little bit about what your concerns are. Some of this we've talked about, reading together, thinking about Don Robbinson's well-known essay on the collapse of voluntarism as a constructive ethos in Jamaican society. But talk to us a little bit about why you think, what you think happened in the making of Jamaican nationalism, and why reconstruction of that history is important in order for us to better appreciate the prospect of a post-nationalism.
A big question.
There is if you drank rum, you're not a different form.
We turned off the electronic.
All of that.
Yeah, the political takes over, invades and completely takes over by the early 1950s and going forward. Something much more exciting, and hesitating because some people in the room know something of that background from reading and others don't. And so maybe just to sketch a little bit of this entity called Jamaica Welfare starts in 1937. So before the year before the People's National Party starts, with Norman Manley's initiative and with him at the head of it. The year before he gets persuaded to take up the helm of the People's National Party, the Nationalist Party of Jamaica. And Jamaica Welfare comes about because he negotiates, he's on a legal case, he's a lawyer, he's on a very prominent lawyer, not only locally, but doing international cases, a case involving a dispute between the Jamaica Banana Producers Association, a local cooperative of mostly medium-sized and large banana farmers, and the United Fruit Company. And Manley, the United Fruit Company is basically trying to keep the Jamaica banana producers out of the international banana market. And so they're fighting back, and they come to a negotiated settlement, and Manley, as part, Samuel Zimori, the head of United Fruit at the time, is so persuaded by Manley's argument, or so the story goes, that really, this is that, the Jamaican working class and peasantry need avenues to develop, and so on and so on. So Zimori comes back to their last meeting with a proposal that Manley accepts to pay into this fund a cess of 1 cent, I think, on each bunch of exported bananas into this fund that Manley will set up an organization to administer. And this is the birth of Jamaica Welfare. So they have a source of funding, importantly, independent of the colonial state in the 1930s. And so Manley assembles this board of prominent Jamaicans, including Rudolph Burke, a black planter of St. Thomas in the parish, including Euthio McKay, the brother of Claude McKay, who was a prominent Clarendon parish figure, planter and teacher. including Edith Clark and a few other people. And this community development fund then he assembles another cohort of people who are the kind of underground working officers of Jamaica welfare, and it starts in a few communities. A couple of the earliest ones being Guys Hill, Upper St. Mary's and Catherine on the St. Mary's and Catherine border, and Chorus on Manchester, and other communities they gradually expand. Figure out community development. And they don't know what they're doing. They're kind of trying to figure it out as we go. And the people, this working staff on the ground, really select the best and the brightest from the Jamaican and the teaching population. So in a similar kind of pattern in Latin America, where the heads of the Black community are the preachers and teachers. Yeah. And so then we select a few of these people. Eddie Burke is one name, Thomas Gervin, so Gervin's dad, Norman Gervin's father, who would have been among them. And here the personal comes in. So as a child, I was born into a family where my aunt, one of my aunts, Mary Carnegie Kelly, she had been teaching at Westwood High School, and Manley selects her. So she becomes the Jamaica welfare officer in Guys Hill. So that's my personal connection with it. Yeah, sorry. No.
So one of the things I want to get to about one of the things I want to get to is the emergence in Jamaica, particularly Jamaica welfare, which is various kinds of institutions, health education, cultural education, etc., community development.
Yeah.
Are the seeds of construction of the idea of social, which is further animated after the more information and the emergence of the survey. And there is an idea of social, the opposition, within which
yes.
And that's what I want to do. That's one of the things that is very fascinating about worry about where we are in Jamaica.
And I guess, I'm trying to figure it out too. Still. Yeah. So the question begins from most important in emergency through the ending of the drying up of the independence of the fund. By there, and supported the banana export market collapses. This money isn't coming in. They're doing good work on the ground. We're getting the projects going on various kinds in terms of food projects, nutrition, health education, right? So they persuade, and therefore the money commission comes in and endorses in part that kind of vision that resources into the social and so the colonial government is persuaded to fund it through the colonial development and welfare mortgages in barbados. And with that, then this becomes started. Then the plan is still tries to keep the board and the staff. Even though we know very mass writing keep it himself. And even though many of the in voting can keep, he doesn't, on the records that are talking to people, he has really to separate it from their different. Then come they become the government. And then you see the things fully completed. And then the American company completes that process brutally in 1962 by purging many of the old staff of the organization and his own very close watch on what it does and so on and so forth. The focus from the kind of approach, a much more generative, consultative approach. What people on the problems against their needs and guys here and so on. And again, negotiated discussion between the middle class leaders of the organization or facilitators of this development and people on the ground. From that, when Luciano becomes Minister of Development and Welfare in the 1960s, he launches the 100 Villages program, where you build community centers for people and you furnish them with whatever they need. And then of course, within years, demolish them because there's no ownership on the ground of this trust. So the changeover starts in the mid-1940s. And then himself, as chief minister after 1955, is complicit in this. That's to a certain extent, very present is thinking about these community activities. One of the things that we think about is what are the means by which one resides and influence or creates. And by community driven, in this negotiation across the class color divide, Jen talks about improvement. Rachel is talking about her English spot. Cavern is becoming slightly in Jamaica, and as we're trying to think out of ways of how does that get bridged, and so the Houston project, I mean, in the back of that is trying to think about questions of state public space. With attention to things like parks and sidewalks and public transportation, and all of which is neglected in colonial and post-colonial times. Can you create neutral spaces that where these people are in contact with each other, nothing else, and able to see each other as human beings instead of monsters, or
Thank you very, very much. I was smelling stupid.
Thank you all so much for coming. Let's thank our presenters once again. And we look forward to online.
Does anyone have a charger for 5 minutes, maybe? How soon are we leaving? How much time, more time do we have?